If you could tell me about how you moved to the US and your interest in food and nutrition, is it India specific or are you interested at a global outlook to culture and cuisine?
Okay, good. I would say probably it started from a sense of India and within the immigrant community, but I think it has expanded to this whole question of culture, right? And global culture. And partly because I think this is happening in many other places in the US and on campuses. Food has become a bit like what music used to be. In some ways, I mean, music is still important, but there's a sense that that food, especially amongst the younger generation, right? That people's identities, what they eat, what they don't eat, have become part of this kind of a both an aesthetic engagement and an ethical engagement, right? And I think that is driving. Uh, I mean, that eventually turned my attention from kind of a narrower concern to a wider and a broader concern about thinking about food and food culture. Of course, anthropologists have talked about it for a while, almost for 100 years. Anthropology was the field under which food was studied and food culture was studied. But in most parts of the world, food was seen as something you do and something, in some ways, you don't think about too much. That's too imminent, too this worldly. And I think both in the West and in the East, there was a sense that it is the work of the poor, it's the work of the relatively disenfranchised, women, lower class, lower caste, hence not studied in institutions of higher culture, right? So you could do transcendental things, but not very immanent ones. So as that emerged in view, I think I became much more interested in the broader questions of food, food culture, and globally now. And of course, I'm part of a journal called Gastronomica that looks at food culture as a global phenomena from Japanese and Chinese. I think one of the pieces of mine that got the most attention in the Atlantic was on the future of Chinese food. I said, well, Chinese food is going to be expensive in the US. It has usually been considered something cheap, just like Indian food, and why I argued that attention to Chinese food will change in American cities. And it's in the long run, I can see it happening. So I think I started with this kind of a narrower question of food and immigrants. My work continues to be on my first book, The Migrant's Table, was on food and domestic immigrants and domestic cooking. What changes, what doesn't, how does it matter to people, and does it matter? And then my next one was an edited book on basically South Asia and some concepts like curry and globalization of it. And my last book was on immigrants in the US who get into the food business. And we have a long record of that. You know, it's currently, say, South Asians, Chinese, Mexicans, Central Americans. But at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, it was Italians, and Italian is one of the food that has climbed the hierarchy very fast, has become very prestigious, just as, by the way, Japanese food has become where it was 100 years ago. So as I kind of extended my work into these various comparative domains, they became a lot more thinking about what you are talking about, culture and soft power and its relationship to economic power, and in some ways, prestige and power of a nation state. So I would say I came from a narrower end and ending up doing more work in terms of comparative culture.
We had a festival recently, and one of our sessions was on world cuisine, and we had a representative from the Michelin group,
Okay.
and he was saying how important it is for the Michelin group to give award these stars and these awards to restaurants which actually go back to their roots.
Mm,
It's
mm.
not for restaurants who move away and are towards a Western model or towards any external model of quality or professionalism or cuisine, but more towards those who are going closer to the roots of the food that they offer. So,
Yeah.
but we're also talking about going local, growing local, and how can we hold these two both ideas in in our heads and in the food industry.
Yeah, I know. It'll be a challenge. Part of it is that, yes, that's what Michelin is after, but Michelin is after, it's modeled after the French one, which is a sense where chefs, in fact, acquired a lot of prestige and cultural capital. As long as in India we associate cooking with servants, that's not going to happen to Indian culture. I think it's a big challenge. And so it's a very, like, by the way, that's also true about China. And so it's, I mean, India and China, we have a rich local cooking tradition, but I don't know how to get past this bottleneck, which is how do we respect the work of what has historically been done by the poor and dispossessed? Even now, when most in middle class Indians, they talk about cooking, they usually erase the presence of the servant's work. Most Indian cooking, middle class Indian cooking, that Michelin would be very interested in is what I call the servant wife complex of cookery. Wife runs the kitchen, servants do the prep work. So the question, what you're asking is, in some ways, what is the nature of professionalization and its limits of a profession? You know, and in a society in which labor is cheap, a lot of this work is done by poor people. It's very difficult to get through that barrier of respect. Like, say, I would give examples, like the way French chefs are respected, say by Michelin, almost like as artisans, as in fact artists, as celebrities in some ways. The way, say, Japanese have learned to do it, and they have a long tradition, and partly because Japan also emerged from a relatively labor surplus to a labor scarce world. And it can be done through craft, it can be done through guild, it can be done. I think there's the second pathway, which is happening in India too, which is the celebrity through media, you know. So that's a pathway that's open, and I think in some ways it would be could be done like the Japanese tradition of craft in some marriage to media, social media. And it's happening. I mean, in the Indian social media world is very lively. And I think it's beginning to happen by writing. Like, I'm beginning to see American news verticals are emerging in coverage because it's an Anglophone world, and very, very rich writing emerging in the social media. So I think it's a challenge. How do you develop respect for a craft that is done by the poor? That's very difficult to do. You can do it by getting around in terms of by creating, has happened with Indian music, for instance, classical music, with craft. And that you have to do it by in some guild form, right? Which is, you have to reduce, you have to increase cost of entry. If anyone can enter and cook, okay, most people are not going to make a good living doing it. Okay, I mean, so they have to either be in some guild form which restricts, like gharanas, okay, with a leader, with a craft leader, or they, or what's happening also is in terms of social media, which is, say, let's give an example. Say Bombay Canteen, okay, the restaurant in Bombay. It is kind of set up by two young men and who had this very clear sense that They got trained. Some of them got trained in the West, and then they said, "Okay, regional Indian cuisine," and they're going to pursue and follow, and basically do it through social media as a bit of a social media celebrity personality. So I think it can either be done through guild as gharanas, or it can be done through a social media celebrity that is going to play, and I think, an important role and already emerging in India in these young chefs and especially food writers with new media. And the cost also of media has gone down, that in some ways
Yeah.
you can do it on say Instagram live, you can do on Facebook live, and you're beginning to see that. I think it would be through the guild or through the celebrity. And there's a relationship between the two. Guild is the more traditional pathway, and the celebrity is the more kind of a newfangled pathway. And then the question is content, right? You are probably not in this pathway. You are no longer going to be a big deal by cooking chicken tikka masala, tandoori chicken, which have become fatigued in terms of categories, right? It has to be regional, and it has to be almost sub-regional, right? Who is the chef from Bombay Canteen? He just quit, and what's his name? His name will come to me. He's traveling right now in Uttarakhand, and he's doing, say, Gharwali food. He's originally Syrian Christian, and he has what, about 30-40,000 followers on Instagram, and people are being, and those are the young Indian chefs who are going to travel in various parts of India, because two things: there's a lot of promise of Indian food. Most Indians don't know most Indian food, right?
My actually
Because
my a friend of mine, Priya
uh,
Ganapati. I don't know
uh,
if you've heard of a restaurant in Bangalore called Uta. They
okay,
went all around Karnataka. Every district has its own
see,
cuisine, and the way of even catching the fish or the crab is very unique. So,
exactly,
but you don't even get a sense of that when you see the menu card in Bangalore. You
exactly.
just have the same name, but there is no other resonance to the way it's actually done in that particular region.
I think those are the people that that are doing will do it, and in some ways. So I think for me, a cuisine exists wherever there's a language, and wherever there's a dialect, there's a cuisine. Okay, and how to do that, just as the French did, when the French did it at the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century, they did it by almost mapping both. They created a center, which is Paris and Versailles, and they also created various regions. I mean, remember, think about what Michelin is. Michelin is a tire company,
Yeah, true.
right? And the point is, why did Michelin get involved in it? Because they wanted people to travel a destination to eat. So that's maybe the third section, which is either through craft or through social media. And the third category is it has to be regional and sub-regional, I think, almost at the district level, you know. And
Yeah.
I think Indians now, there's a substantial Indian middle class which has money, which travels. Okay, roads have gotten better. Okay, flights have gotten better, airports have gotten better, and I think you are beginning to see that early phase of discovering your own country, and as you do that with some social media exposure to a global world, I think that's the pathway to, in some ways, get global social media presence, which is very cheap, which is price of electricity basically, and a smartphone and a digital network connection. But the other part is the knowledge that has to be developed, because Indians have generally, in some ways, like a lot of emerging urban cultures, we have gravitated towards the big city. We thought cities had all the big style, cool things and culture. Now we have to return to the countryside, and I think that's the next phase. Indians and Chinese in that sense are just on the cusp of beginning to return. And then we have to probably in some way scaffold it, institutionalize it, and have some, in this case, the kind of work you're doing with tourism, and make it visible, this kind of a knowledge, what I would call the vernacular knowledge, right? in local languages. But like all of these things, you need a translator. Maybe the fifth thing there
Yeah.
is you need acts of translation.
Mm.
So you need, say, to give you an example, say someone like me, I come from Odisha. My mom is Odia, my father is Bengali, and I have lived in Bihar, in Chhattisgarh, in Odisha, born in Siliguri, in Benares, and then in Delhi. So I have, say, three Indian languages: Odia, Bengali, Hindi, and then I have English with this kind of English, right? In some ways, and a lot of Indians are like that,
Mm.
right?
True.
A lot of Indians are two languages, three languages,
Yeah.
and especially Indians who have moved around a bit. And so they, in some ways, going down to their roots and then reemerging with a new appreciation for local produce, craft, and then uh, using, I think, a blowhorn to announce it to the global world. And the announcement could be through industry, through processing, through foraging, through restaurants, another one. But of course, restaurants, the problem with restaurants is unless you get very high visibility quickly,
Mm.
it's very difficult to become visible, right?
Yeah.
And so you have to probably first get attention through social media and then the restaurant as a destination. And in some ways, not that different from what the French did and especially what the Italians did. You should see what people thought about Italian food in the US is they thought it was wretched and garlicky and
Mm.
not very interesting. That changed very late 1970s, 1980s, you know, and
I
then
just,
it
yeah, sorry. I just read,
no,
saw a tweet last week where
mm,
there was a big debate about whether the pizza should be eaten with hand or with spoon and fork. And they said actually in Naples it's eaten with spoon and fork and not folded and eaten. So
eaten
they
like
said we're
that.
not
Yeah.
even doing what the authentic Italians.
Yeah, and there'll be all those discussions about it. In fact, in these things, remember, the point is not to be correct. The point is to have an argument that draws attention, right? And so, yeah, so I think it is some combination of Indian internal tourism,
Mm.
Indian middle class rediscovering its roots, and in some ways going back. And I see that all over social media. Where I follow about what, maybe 200 people on Instagram,
Mm.
and they're all doing this, the traveling thali, and these very kind of sorts, and especially India has one advantage: spices.
Mm.
Everyone in the West knows that. So it has to be linked to something about an ecological argument, something about sustainable development argument. And so, in some ways, I would say broadly, rediscovery of that knowledge by the Indian middle class that has historically fled from it, partly because it's low prestige work, you know, and a return to it, and then using tourism soft power like the Thais did. You know, the
Mm.
Thai government, the Japanese government, Italian government, all of them have very, very focused soft power investment in, say, even things that people say are silly, like the Japanese government identifies real Japanese restaurant in the world. Okay, and there are lots of quarrels about it. Italian, the Trade Commission identifies authentic Italian restaurant.
Mm.
Even though people will disagree with it, people will quarrel, it draws attention to it. And in some ways, and India has some massive advantages. Partly, India has many languages, India has many regions, almost incomparable to any other nation in the world. You know, I mean, and I mean, the comparable part is China, but China doesn't have as many languages as India
Mm.
has. And anywhere there's a language, there's a culture,
Yeah.
you know. And India is kind of an exemplar, can become an exemplar, but will need some transformation in taking our food seriously, and taking poor people's work seriously,
Mm.
and then leveraging that
Mm.
to regional government, state governments. Like some governments are very good. Indian state governments are very good in terms of some forms of tourism, but food has never been. Local food has, temples have been, you know, nature has been a target of it. And I think local governments need to also pay some attention to culinary cultures and some mode of consecrating it, saying these are important places where traditional cuisine happens, and by some mechanism show what are these places and can people go, and if people, even people cannot go, can media go, and can you have someone on like Netflix chef show, right? And like all the chef shows of Netflix are, the only Indians are Indians abroad. Gagan in Singapore, Bangkok, and then Asma Khan in London. And so the point is to be able to draw some of these into India. It's getting ripe, but we are not there yet.
Wonderful. What about your course itself? Do you think such a course would, what does it comprise of? And can we do a course like this in India for Indian cooks so that we
We
are
should.
grooming the next generation of
Absolutely. So I think some of it has to do with doing food studies, and I would say the analogy there is like cinema studies. People didn't take movies seriously. They thought it was it's just fun and games,
entertainment?
entertainment. So no one studies entertainment. NYU did cinema studies, was the first, and that's, by the way, another thing that happens is places like NYU will do it because places like Harvard don't need to do it. They can do the old classical disciplines. They'll do their sociology, they'll do their history, and they'll be fine. It is the second tier institutions that are hungry for attention. Okay. And I think in the Indian case, that'll be the same. You probably will not have it in the first tier, but you will have it in the second tier institutions that are hungry. And I think food studies is important in some ways in creating this kind of a recalibration of culture, the importance of food culture. And that can go with hospitality schools, culinary schools, or humanities schools. Culinary schools and hospitality schools. I was a dean at the Culinary Institute of America. It gets certain amount of attention, but in India, you don't get respect unless you are in the university. So there's going to be some trade-off between culinary school, hospitality school, tourism. I think management schools are getting interested in it. I'm giving a talk. In fact, in March, I have 2 talks in India. And because now with Zoom, it has become cheaper and easier to do. And I think we will, what you're pointing to is, I would say, what is in some ways called educational capital has to be invested a little in it, so that people know how to talk about these things and what are the concepts and what is important and what would an international audience be interested in. I have a friend of mine in Germany, and she's very interested in doing a very small alternative group traveling, say, to Bhubaneswar and parts of Odisha that is not known at all in Germany. Okay. But do it in terms of some exposure to, say, places where they grow palm, places where they grow rice. We will go to a rice paddy field, and a group of 10, 12, 15 people, but high-end tourists, where they will spend $5,000, $10,000 rather than backpackers, So $5,000 for 7 days, and someone who can then interpret it. For a lot of Indian small town middle class people, they don't realize how important their culture is, right? Because they have received this idea that big city has all these kind of good fashionable things. So that retraining has to happen to segments of the Indian middle class who can then articulate that. And some of it has to happen in schools, in colleges, in hospitality schools, in business schools, and eventually in universities. And that's, by the way, that's how the Americans also recognized it. Everyone thought Americans had terrible food, and Americans thought Americans had terrible food. That changed over the last 30 years. You have more celebrity chefs in the US than anywhere else in the world.
And I think you're working on, did some research during COVID. What do you think the last year has done to regional foods and to big restaurants? And has it been has it actually democratized this industry so that everyone has an equal playing field?
I would, I mean, I don't know the specifics in other parts. I have worked in US and a bit in, say, Singapore and Europe. I mean, in some ways, it has decimated the business. But those who will survive, those who are surviving, are at the top of it or at the bottom end of it. So where you're competing with basically price. So American chains are doing very well. McDonald's, especially because it's takeout, it's delivery, it's
Yes.
not sit down experience. And very high end ones are doing well, but they had to pivot. They had to move to, what's it, Daniel Hum's 11 Madison Park, which is the one of the top restaurants. It did by 11 Madison at home. So they'll send you a package, where they have the best quality meat, they have the best quality fish. Most Americans cannot buy this kind of quality fish and produce, and branded now by the chef, Daniel Hum, and with a bottle of wine. And now they'll send it home to you for $200. And of course, you can do a lot more of it, because the problem, remember, of a restaurant like Daniel Hum's is you can feed maximum 100 people, maybe 200 people a night. Okay. Now what's happening is he realized he can do this to hundreds of people, because now he doesn't need very expensive space,
Retail,
real
yeah.
estate space,
Yeah.
and so that, I think, what's happening is the transformation of the industry that's going to happen. And of course, laws had to be changed, that the restaurant could sell a bottle of wine, people can take it out and deliver. The laws had to be changed, so some of that had to change. Laws had to change that restaurants could open up, put a couple of tables on the sidewalk. No, so that law had to change. So with that, we have seen about half the restaurants are in fact not doing badly. Okay, but they are all either very cheap or very expensive. It has become, and there is some luck about where they are located. If they're located in a street corner, on an avenue and a street where they get the corner lot, they can sit. Now it's too cold, but in September, October, November, they did very well. They're going to do well again, probably at the end of this month, end of March, maybe April. I think in New York City, we get sometimes the last snowstorm, sometimes in April. But that's mostly March. After this month, I think some of them are going to do much better. And of course, the vaccine is also spreading, and now it's about 13%. But by the end of the month, it should be about 22%. And by the time you get to 50%, you might get what you get in some of the Indian cities, what you're getting, seropositivity, in this case, vaccine, which is, my brother is a critical care physician in Delhi. He was saying there are parts of Delhi has 60% seropositivity. That is, people have already been infected, and so that is going to create protection. So here it's going to be the vaccine, most probably. So I think end of March, you're going to see that. But lower end of the market and very high end of the market, with new imaginings, are doing well. But all of them, by the way, have to have a social media presence. That's
Yeah.
like a Daniel
In a,
Hum or a David Chang. They have to be constantly be visible to a public who wants to go and eat at their place because they are associated, or order food at their place.
yeah.
You know?
So I thank you so much. I'll just ask one personal
Yep.
question.
Yep.
What are your personal food likes and dislikes, and why?
Ah, I
Do you have a nostalgia for Indian food, or
Oh,
you?
absolutely. I love Indian food. I mean, my Indian food nostalgia is for Bengali food because of my father, and Odia food because of my mother, like Sontula. Sontula is the simplest of, like, a vegetable stew with garlic, light vegetable runny stew, like a very kind of a typical South Indian, like peninsular Indian cooking. So rice and dal, but I also cook. I cook extensively. I cook almost every day, and I cook right now. I've been cooking from East Africa, from a book called BB's Kitchen from Somalia, and I'm cooking also this other cookbook I'm using, nothing fancy. And I you often use the recipes from the New York Times. I'm not a chef, but I'm a
Mm.
home cook, and I have been, in fact, cooking a lot more through the pandemic,
Okay.
and partly because I'm stuck at home and
Right.
cooking, and people like me
Mm.
who have a job and a place to live and a nice place to live is it's kind of in some ways it's much more fun to do the cooking.
Yeah.
So yeah, I cook a lot, and for others, for guests, and of course that not so much guests right now, but my
Yeah.
son and my family.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.